we want to talk further down the line about the whole, from a legal point of view, because you're just the best legal there is, about the whole Phillip Schofield thing. But one of the reasons I love talking about news with you is because you do bring that calm, level-headed, legal thinking brain to the whole process. Let's talk about the post office. I mean, this is something that people forget about. I don't know about you. I just think it's one of the most awful recent cases. For people who can't remember, because we tend to forget once it goes off the front pages, between 1999 and 2015, more than 700 postmasters, those are the people down your local, could be a grocery shop or what have you, and have a post service in the back. They're called postmasters. Well, 700 of them, more than them, owners and managers of local post office branches, were wrongly prosecuted for crimes such as theft, fraud, and false accounting. In fact, the missing money was actually caused by dozens of bugs in the post office's £1 billion pound IT system. Now, the effect of, some people did a bit of jail time. There's been, people take their lives, people have breakdowns, families break up, people have gone to their graves. Some people said, you know what, I can't fight this, handed over their life savings. And what they got in return, I mean, and the legal support that they got, and what continues to happen is an absolute travesty. Well, the latest thing is, when it comes to people of colour, the post office gave out information. I'll leave it to you because I can't even say this. It's so outrageous, Joseph. Just tell us what sort of directions the post office gave to investigators investigating these supposed baddies when it was their own screw up. Well,
I have to say, as a defence lawyer, none of it came as any surprise to me, having been on the other end, of having had clients on the other end, Trisha, of prosecutions by these kind of quasi-governmental, some of them private, shareholder-owned, like Royal Mail now is, organisations who prosecute and shoot from the hip with a relative lack of oversight. And I have to say, often a blundering level of inexperience and kind of gung-hoism in the way in which they approach it. Trisha, you're right. It's disturbing language. I want us to remain, as always, where we can, level and cerebral and not take the conclusions too far. But let's just summarize it. And this is from the Times article, I think.
Yeah.
Internal guidance has revealed that the Royal Mail's investigators were asked to categorize suspects as Negroid types, dark-skinned European types. That basically means kind of Balkans and Gypsy and Roma and those types of epithet. White-skinned European types and Indian Pakistani types. Of course, as every Indian and Pakistani will tell you, they're basically the same thing. How ignorant! Chinese, Japanese types. It's like something out of the 1950s, and Arabian Egyptian types. And the guidance on how to fill out the covering form for case files revealed this. And that's every single case that's opened is through the lens of not just categorizing them, but there's an element of dehumanizing them and reducing them to a type. There were other character categorizations in the list: West Indian, Nigerian, African, Caribbean, etc., which was underneath that this really quasi-scientific outdated term Negroid. Now, I have to say this, Trisha. I'm always very uncomfortable about the attacking of people for use of language rather than intention. The criminalization of language, you know, my grandmother might have said, there's a lovely old black fella, you know, who lives next door. And, you know, that might be regarded as too direct now, but you know, in terms of the language, but at the same time, you can see from the context, there's nothing but kind of joy and a kind of descriptive element to the way she's talking. talking about that person. So intention, I think, should always be kind of considered ahead of language. But sometimes the language, if it's so poor, that detail reveals can reveal an intention, and the fact that, you know, this is the way that the file is opened. I think at the very least, without necessarily rushing to judgment and saying this person, rather than being ignorant, was racially motivated, because isn't the really key question whether these 700 people whose lives were ruined, no question about it, Court of Appeal and some pitiful level of cost back does not right people who had been doing 20, 30 and 40 years in a community, often as immigrants, establishing themselves.
And often, I mean, the post office as being the hubs of community, but it does smack, the whole thing does smack of how the lens through which what that person's alleged or supposed, in this case, misdemeanor was, if the lens is through which racial category they fit into, coming with that, there are all sorts of suppositions and what have you, all sorts of, well, they would, wouldn't they? Yes. That sort of thing. I mean, when that's your lens, I mean, really, if this had been a bona fide case, and these people really had done something rather than the post office screw up, then what would it matter? What would it matter? They'd either be guilty or not guilty, and their race would have nothing to do with it.
Absolutely. And Trisha, I think, you know, the way in which you're discussing this, I think we should be calling now, right here on the program, for data analysis, which should show whether it was more likely that you would be investigated or prosecuted based on those categorizations in this disgusting institutional abuse of the Royal Mail's, sometimes questionable in my view, right to prosecute. This is the information now required to see if the language here is a clue to something grotesquely sinister.
Yes, absolutely. And just before, we're going to take a break and we're going to be back with more headlines. And you make just such a poignant point. And here's the thing. If it wasn't, then you wonder what was the language all about. If that wasn't the intention. And we've got to say the post office points to the then census at the time and says, well, they made the same differentiations. Oh, but as you came back to that intent with very, very different intent.
The language is a bit clumsy, isn't it, Trisha?
Just the Negroid type.
Do you remember the independent group party where the woman described people as having a sort of funny tinge? Maybe she was all right. Maybe she was just ignorant. I really don't know.
No, but when you're applying law and taking people's livelihoods away from them, it's a scary one. We're going to take a break. I will be back with more headlines with Joseph right after this. Welcome back. I'm with Joseph Kotrie-Monson, a broadcaster and lawyer, legal eagle supreme. Boris Johnson met with ex-President Trump. Sorry, I'm laughing because I was doing a bit of research and looking back at the days when Boris got in, Trump called him Britain Trump. Johnson was eager to forge a strong personal relationship with Mr. Trump back in those days for trade reasons. But then they clashed in 2015 when Johnson was London mayor, because Johnson said that Trump's claim that immigration had produced no-go areas in London displayed, quote, stupefying ignorance that makes him frankly unfit for the office of the presidency. Well, all of that seems to be forgotten, as I'm sure President Trump will forget about Carlson Tucker calling him an absolute idiot, or words to that effect. So they have met, had dinner at one of the former president's golf clubs, and there it's all of this happening while, of course, Boris is in the spotlight again for Partygate. So let's talk about the whole the whole Boris Gate thing will never give up. It's following him all the way to the States. But let's talk about him being in the States for yet another lucrative speaking deal.
Well, he's milking it, isn't he? But Tony Blair milked it in the same way. Let's not be too partisan about it. And it's something that's increasingly popular with ex-US presidents over the last 20 years or so, I suppose, too. A couple of really interesting things going on about this. And the overwhelming sense of irony of these two men who are both facing not just criminal investigation in Boris Johnson's case, but a criminal prosecution which is ongoing, possibly multiple if you count the Mar-a-Lago stolen retained
files. Now, yes, they're now saying that they've got evidence that Trump did show some of those files to other people as well, which brings in possible charges of espionage and all sorts of things.
And frankly, knowing what we know about, or most of us suspect about the man morally, probably nothing's beneath him in that regard. But of course, we don't know the facts. The Boris, meanwhile, being circled by the vultures, really, isn't he, over COVID lockdown parties, but the vultures have blue wings. It's really, there's really a sense that this is coming from within. More on that in a minute, Trisha. It's all about the Chequers diaries, isn't it? And these Chequers diaries, which apparently have thousands and thousands of entries in them, and he couldn't possibly know them. We'll talk about what we think about that shortly. But it's evidence apparently of friends of his visiting him at Chequers. That's important if they're friends without an official capacity, without any apparent work excuse during lockdown. And if he wasn't finished already, this king over the water, Boris Johnson, who might be waiting to steam back in on a charging horse in the context of Rishi Sunak's, or at least that administration's diminishing popularity, because I think there's a lot of, there's some respect for Sunak, but despite that, it's a party that's at the moment somewhat beleaguered in the way that the mid-90s sleaze Tory government was. I have to say, in the context of what's going on with this particular thing, I really thought, why the story? Where is this coming from? And to answer that, we must look at the source of the evidence. It's from the government itself. So it looks like the Tories are disclosing them, these diary entries themselves. And why is that? Well, an inside job, I think, to try to neutralize Johnson as a threat to retake the party in the light of that diminishing confidence in the Sunak administration after those local election results. There's probably a resignation and a feeling that the Tories can't win the next election, even within its own party, which is enough, is it, for Johnson being enough of a threat to the party to risk hurting itself in this way, because there's fallout from that, even if they deal with that goal. But I have to say, as a lawyer, Trisha, Boris Johnson's defense blurted out to, I think, a Sky News reporter the other day, is really interesting. He says, and I'm quoting here, "I just think it's totally nonsensical and bizarre," very Boris Johnson words, aren't they, "that there are tens of thousands of entries in the Prime Minister's diary. I've never seen these things before." Okay, but is the case against you what's in the diary? That's the source of the evidence.
Oh, yes.
Is it the evidence itself? Trisha, he's doing what slightly unskilled and overconfident defendants sometimes and witnesses sometimes do in criminal cases. He's seeking to conflate the source of the evidence with the evidence itself. And the cross-examination goes like this: Boris, if they are your friends in the diary, that is evidence that they attended, whether or not you saw that diary. So saying that you've never seen these things before is irrelevant. It's evidence that points to it. What's your explanation?
Yeah. It's sort of like, if he said, well, I didn't say anything, somebody else wrote that in the diary, but who gave the information about who those people
were? Did they come or not, Trisha? That's it.
It's do you know there's a lot of parallels between the Republican Party, falling in on itself, like the snake eating its own tail, with the Conservatives, because now the divisions. I mean, it's a bigger field, but with Ron DeSanctimonious, as Trump calls him, Ron DeSantis throwing his hat in the ring, and Trump as well. So there's the focus is on the infighting and the splitting of votes, and it's happening to on both sides of the water. I doubt the characters being themselves that they would have spoken about that. I mean, one of the things they did talk about apparently was the Iraq War, which on one hand you've got Boris, who's one of the things he's big upped himself for, if you like, and perhaps rightfully so, is his support. If you remember, he went over to the Ukraine, he did that surprise visit and everything. He's been very pro let's help Ukraine. Meanwhile, what did Trump just say? I was having a look recently. Trump just sort of questioned, why are we sending all of that money over there? Has talked about it, when he was asked in that my other job in CNN that it wasn't a debate, it was what did they call it? I called it a car crash. But when he actually spoke about it, he said, I just don't like people dying. He was pressed on Ukraine, Trump would not say, and he said, well, and Putin's a very clever man who made a mistake. So he's been very waffly, and he doesn't want to put Putin offside. So if Boris was hoping to win Trump over, I'm like, you're wasting your time, mate.
They'll always be divided on that, but American isolationism is not a particularly new thing, and the contrasting idea of American as the moral policeman of the world, etc., is a conflicting perspective. I mean, of course, Ukraine's on our doorstep. It supplies us with gas. It supplies Europe. It's Europe's breadbasket, the world's breadbasket, but it also supplies us with natural resources that we require. One wonders what Donald Trump's attitude would be if the Russians popped over from Siberia just across the Bering Strait, a few miles, into Canada.
Yeah.
Let's see what his attitude would be then with regards to, when it was on his own doorstep. And really, that's the point, isn't it? You're not really comparing like with like.
So then, last but not least, the whole, Phillip Schofield affair. The most recent developments being that, he's stepped down from everything. He says he's walking away from ITV, and he's apologized for lying to his employers, to his colleagues, to everybody else. I'm, as I said right at the beginning, early 2020 is when a lot of this, when ITV in their statement, because they've just got a statement that they've put out, which I have to hand somewhere. There it is. ITV has said that it was not provided with and did not find any evidence of a relationship beyond hearsay and rumour when it investigated rumours of a relationship between Phillip Schofield and an ITV employee, which were denied by both parties in early 2020. Well, as I said before, I mean, I've been at ITV for many, many years. I was doing Dancing on Ice. Of course, Holly and Philip were presenting that. We were at the National Television Awards. I was seated right behind them. All I'm going to say is that this has been an open secret. This stuff has been an open secret for so long. I'm really surprised it's only come out now. ITV and ITV statement, to be fair, I guess if you're an employer, you can't go on rumour and innuendo. If you actually go to the people and say, is this going on? And they say no. But here's where I'm confused. If your only crime is for lying, then why step down? Because if your only crime was lying, Donald Trump would have gone. Boris would have gone. Half the flipping government wouldn't be there after day one. I mean, I'm not laughing to make light of it, but lying in of itself is seen in this day and age, it's almost a pre-bloody requisite, excuse my French.
Trisha, you've gone to the thorniest bit straight away, the bit that we have to be most careful about, the bit that when I was doing my own analysis a few minutes ago of this story, I was thinking, well, if we're going there, we better get our ballerina shoes on, you know. Let's say this. It's so looming obvious that we're not being told everything. And that's because, as you've rightly pointed out straight away, without pussyfooting about it, that if the relationship was inappropriate, consensual, and we're told not illegal, which I think is pretty much the exact words of Schofield, more likely his lawyers, I think, in a statement, why has he been sacked? Not just by the employer, but by his own management and agent team. An affair is not enough for you to be completely, professionally decapitated, ostracized, even by your own team who you're providing a living for on the 15% agents fees or whatever, which they're getting. And that's what seems to be happening now. It's a bit odious and it's a bit suspicious, but we've got to be so careful because we just don't know. But Schofield got the boy the job, calling him a boy, whether he was 18, 21 or whatever. Yeah. Schofield's not a boy. We can say that. All right. But certainly Schofield agrees that the guy was a teenager when they met. And the story doesn't really make sense unless there's something much more serious at play. Now, don't get me wrong. That could be something that did Schofield credit or provided an explanation that he's under some kind of pressure or illegitimate thing. So we don't want to say much more and we don't want to risk defaming him because we really don't know. But he may be a victim of other forces that we don't know about that's concealing the truth. And that's it. We just don't know. But all we do have at the moment is a series of facts that don't follow logically. I tell you what, Trisha, you're right there. Everyone knew for years. Everyone on Twitter, from what I've seen, has known stuff that ITV says they didn't know till last week.
Well, I can tell you, they said it was brought to their notice in 2020, which was, as I said, but what I find, I mean, it's lots and lots of bits, and I hate that we're so sort of good or bad, goody or baddie. When I look back, and I like looking back at press, everyone was like, especially when Phillip came out, which was just before that Dancing on Ice rap party and everything else. Everyone was like, oh, all of the celebs lining up to say, oh my gosh, you're brave, you're wonderful, it doesn't matter, like that. All of those ones. Now, I mean, I'm sorry, but when somebody falls, and you use the same term with Boris Johnson, the vultures are so quick to dive in. Whatever he did, it's not for us to be judge, jury, and executioner. I'm really mindful of people like Caroline Flack, who was judged to have done this, that, and the other unfairly without people knowing the full facts. So, I mean, this piling on, and my issue, Joseph, that I brought up the other day was pictures taken of Phillip with his elderly mother in his car. I mean, his elderly mother did nothing, you know, and I just think press intrusion and let's all get him when anybody falls off there, and somebody put it in a tweet to Peter Cardwell, their moral pedestal. That's as much as we know at the moment. This whole let's go and get him sort of thing, it's a bit over the top, and it's a bit, I don't think it shows, after all the be kind stuff, I don't think it shows the kind of thing that suddenly everybody's got a story about how nasty Phillip Schofield was to them. I've got to be honest, he was only ever the absolute gentleman and perfect colleague to me. Doesn't mean to say he might have been like that with everyone, but I just don't like the piling in.
Well, you know what? I was part of his generation with kind of Gordon the Gopher, on CBBC. You know, the guy was
my friend Emma Forbes on Live and Kicking. My darling friend Emma Forbes.
Wow.
Good mate of mine here in the States.
We need to hang out with Emma, right? But it's just all very personal. This non-legal opinion just always struck me as quite a kind character in a way that you probably couldn't fake. And I think it's right. This idea of, you know, as Frank Sinatra once said, flying high in April, shot down in May. You know, it's a binary outcome. You're either hated or you're loved in the end. You know, he wasn't a politician. He wasn't preaching values. I have to say, I wasn't applauding him coming out quite in the way that he did in the context of the fact that he was married, you know, and you know, I imagine there was a kind of element of fallout there. But frankly, I don't know what the atmosphere was like there and what level of support he had and all of that. But I mean, it's all difficult, isn't it? And it's hard for gay men and women. It's perhaps not as hard as it was in the past, but the you know, I'm reluctant to kind of to assume too much about knowing what's you know, how to walk in somebody's shoes. I have to say, I whether it's heterosexual or homosexual, I'm often a bit alarmed at the idea of young people in relationships with older people, not because I think that it's not love, but because there can be a sense of it. Yeah, inequality, imbalance, especially not just the age, but the wealth, and you know, the fact that
the power.
And you know, but at the same time, these things do so turn on their individual facts and the genuineness of people's feelings as well. And honestly, who am I to know? I wasn't there with the fly on the wall. And I was going to say, I mean, because so many times as bosses and secretaries, I mean, we don't everybody says, oh, you scored well, or, you know, what have you. We don't look at the power imbalance there. And that's a whole different argument. Just to finish up, from a point of view of the companies, you know, in generally speaking, I'm not talking exclusively about ITV now, but for a company, there are also legal ramifications as well. I mean, the fact that we're getting these statements. It's super weird because that, like I said, it's so obvious. By emphasizing the consensual nature of that relationship and also making the distinction of age, it's either a lawyer wrote that or a lawyer observed it and checked it. So we've got a situation where where this is already being closely managed by lawyers, and we don't really know why, because the crucial thing here, and this is really evidentially from a legal perspective, this is why ITV might have felt unable to act. Both parties denied it.
Yes.
So honestly, where's the evidence? And that you don't get, not only do you not get beyond reasonable doubt as to whether there was something going on in that context, you don't even, there's not even a case to answer from a legal perspective if they're both denying it. If I've got a client and and they're alleged to have done something by the relative of somebody else, let's say, and it's a sexual allegation, but the person he's supposed to have done it to says, no, it didn't happen, or won't give a statement, there is no case, and there shouldn't even be a criminal investigation. The same, I have to say, from a legal perspective, was true as far as what parties knew then was concerned.
Yeah, it's an interesting one, and I'm sure it'll rumble on for quite a while. Joseph, it's always an absolute pleasure talking to you. Look forward to doing it again really soon. Mate, there you are, I called him mate. Joseph Kotrie-Monson, lawyer and broadcaster. Back with more in just a moment.